The metal of the key was ice cold against my skin, a brutal contrast to the warmth of the tears still drying on my face. I had just buried my husband, Robert, the man with whom I had shared a pillow for 45 years, and all I wanted was the familiar silence of the walls that had watched us grow old. But the key wouldn't turn. I tried a second time, my hand trembling so much that the keychain sounded like a small funeral bell in the oppressive air of that Cleveland afternoon. That's when I saw him. My son Mark appeared at the living room window, not with the face of a grieving son, but with the impassive expression of a bailiff. He opened the door just enough for his body, dressed in an expensive suit that seemed to mock our pain, to form an insurmountable barrier. His eyes, which I had once taught to see the world, looked at me as if I were a complete stranger, a delinquent tenant. His voice cut through the cold autumn air, each word a sharp and precise blade. "The house is mine now, Mom. Dad's will is clear. You have 1 hour to get your personal items from the boxes I left in the garage. After that, I need you to leave." The world stopped. The scent of the funeral wreaths from the cemetery still clung to my black dress, and the pain of losing Robert was an open wound in my chest. But in that instant, a new and more violent pain supplanted it. It wasn't just the loss of a roof over my head. It was the demolition of my identity, my history, the very notion of family. I had been demoted from matriarch to a mere obstacle to be removed. There, on the porch of the house I had built with love and sacrifice, with the cold wind whipping at my legs, I did not cry. A cold, terrifying calm took hold of me. In that deafening silence, as my only son exiled me from my own life, I did not plan revenge. I planned my resurrection. If you love Jesus and believe this story will teach us something, subscribe so you don't miss the next episodes of stories of healing and wisdom. Your subscription is an act of faith in your own transformation. I ask you to join our community of souls who have gone through something similar. My son didn't move a muscle as I stood on the porch, feeling the weight of 45 years of history vanishing beneath my feet. The silence that settled between us was heavier and colder than any tombstone in the cemetery we had just left. I could feel the curious eyes of the neighbors through their curtains, their silhouettes moving like ghosts in the approaching twilight. The neighborhood, which had always been my sanctuary of peace and community, suddenly transformed into a stage for my private humiliation. Every gust of wind that rustled the trees and scattered the dry leaves across the sidewalk seemed to whisper of my disgrace. Mark, my Mark, the boy to whom I had read bedtime stories and whose knees I had bandaged, stood there, blocking the door with the authority of a jailer. His luxury watch glinted for a moment, an offensive beacon of prosperity amidst the darkness of my grief. He showed not an ounce of sadness for the loss of his father. His calculating eyes were focused only on the completion of a cold transaction. I was the last item to be liquidated. My existence, my presence in that house, was an impediment to his plans, a bureaucratic detail to be resolved. The pain in my chest was so physical, I had to hold on to the railing to keep from collapsing. I was no longer Eleanor Miller, wife, mother, and owner of that house. I was a problem, and his solution was to erase me, to discard me like an old piece of furniture that no longer matched the new decor of his life. He finally broke the silence, not with a word of comfort or explanation, but with an impatient gesture toward the side of the house. "The boxes are in the garage. The clock is ticking," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. Every step I took on the stone path leading to the garage was torture. The stones, which Robert and I had, laid together on a distant spring day, now seemed unstable, treacherous. The garage door was open, revealing the scene of my dismantled life. 3 cardboard boxes, carelessly sealed with packing tape. It was then that the first stab of public humiliation struck me. Mrs. Gable, my next-door neighbor for 20 years, with whom I had exchanged recipes and lamented about the weather, was walking her little terrier. She saw me there, next to those boxes, my face swollen and my funeral dress wrinkled. Her steps faltered, and she offered me a confused wave, a silent question in her kind eyes. Before I could even think of a response, Mark came out of the house, composing his face into a mask of a caring son. "Hello, Mrs. Gable," he said with a frightening cordiality. "Just helping Mom organize a few things for donation. She's moving into a wonderful retirement community. A new beginning, you know." The lie was so perfect, so smoothly delivered, that it stole my breath. He hadn't just kicked me out. He had rewritten the story in front of everyone, turning me into a senile old woman who passively agreed to her own abandonment, while he posed as the exemplary son. Mrs. Gable smiled, visibly relieved by the plausible explanation, and continued on her way, leaving me paralyzed in the coldness of that lie. With numb hands, I approached the boxes. The smell of dust and stored memories filled my nostrils. I tore the tape off one of them, and what I saw inside was the final desecration. Family photo albums, their leather covers worn by the touch of generations, were tossed in alongside old gardening tools. The little blue sweater I had knitted for Mark when he was a baby was crumpled under a pair of Robert's rain boots. Every object was a relic, and he had treated them like trash. I could take almost nothing. Where would I go with a photo album? What door would I open with the old keys to the country house we sold years ago? My entire life was there. But I know, longer had a place to keep it. With trembling fingers, I fished a small, polished wooden box from the mess. Inside it were the few things I could not leave behind. Robert's wedding ring, which he had asked me to keep when his fingers became too swollen. A faded photograph of my parents on their wedding day. And a small lock of Mark's blonde hair, saved in a yellowed envelope from his first haircut. I closed the box, the click of the lid sounding like the closing of a coffin. Mark appeared at the garage door, his gaze fixed on his watch. "Time's up, Mom." His voice was final. I picked up my purse and the small wooden box, turned my back on the other two boxes and all they represented, and walked out of the garage. The sound of the front door slamming shut and the lock turning echoed down the silent street. The streetlights began to flicker on, one by one, illuminating my path to nowhere. I knew the night would be long and cold, but I had no idea yet that the most biting chill would come. Not from the Ohio wind, but from the unexpected kindness of a complete stranger. 45 years. It's long enough for the roots of a tree to break through concrete, and it was the time I spent building my home in that house in Cleveland. I remember when Robert and I bought it. The walls smelled of fresh paint and promises. I gave up my small dream of working in a library, the scent of old books and respectful silence exchanged for the aroma of applesauce and the sound of a baby's laughter. Mark wasn't just my son, he was my project, my masterpiece. Every inch of that house holds the ghost of his childhood. The pencil height marks on the kitchen door frame, the small scratch on the wooden floor where he fell with his first roller skates, the lingering smell of damp earth on the entryway rug from all the times he ran in from the garden with muddy shoes and an innocent smile. Robert worked double shifts at the auto parts factory, his hands always stained with grease, his body tired, but his eyes always shone when he saw Mark. "We're doing this for him, Ellie," he used to say, and I believed him. My life was a cycle of silent, loving sacrifices, sleepless nights, timed meals, saving for his education, and a love so vast I believed it was an impenetrable fortress. I wasn't just raising a son, I was weaving the fabric of a family, believing that every thread of dedication would be repaid with loyalty and affection. I was naive to think that unconditional love would, by itself, create an unconditionally good son. The first crack in that fortress appeared when Mark went to college. It was subtle, like a fine hairline crack in a porcelain cup that you only notice when the hot liquid begins to leak. He, a boy from a working-class neighborhood, suddenly found himself surrounded by young people from wealthy families, and shame began to eat away at him from the inside. He stopped inviting us to campus events. When he came home for the holidays, he brought with him an air of superiority, an impatience with our simple way of life. His conversations were peppered with brand names we didn't know and references to places we would never visit. The shirts I ironed so carefully were wrinkled. The homemade food I prepared with his favorite dishes was heavy. Robert, in his fatherly pride, saw this as ambition, as his son's desire to move beyond our origins. "He's becoming a man of the world, Ellie," he would say, unable to see the veiled contempt that accompanied this transformation. I felt it, but I kept quiet. I convinced myself it was just a phase, the shell a young man needs to build to protect himself in the world. I continued to send packages with his favorite cookies, which he never acknowledged, and tried to start conversations about his classes, receiving short, disinterested answers in return. The warmth that once united us was being replaced by a cold formality, and I felt my son becoming a stranger who spoke my language but no longer understood my heart. The humiliation ceased to be veiled and became a public spectacle at his graduation dinner. Mark invited us to a French restaurant downtown, a place with white linen tablecloths and so many utensils that I felt completely lost. Robert and I dressed in our best clothes, which, under the golden lights of the restaurant, suddenly seemed old and out of fashion. Mark barely spoke to us. He was more interested in impressing his professors and the parents of his new girlfriend, Jennifer, a blonde young woman with a polished smile and eyes that sized me up and down with coldness. At one point, I tried to tell a funny story about Mark's childhood, and he cut me off mid-sentence with a forced smile. "Mom, I don't think anyone here is interested in my diaper stories," he said, and the condescending laughter from the other guests at the table felt like a slap in the face. Later, when I tried to pronounce the name of a dish on the menu, he corrected me loudly. "It's coq au vin, Mom, not coq au van," as if I were an ignorant child. I felt the blood rush to my cheeks. I spent the rest of the evening in silence, pushing the expensive food around my plate, feeling Jennifer's pitying gaze on me. In that moment, I was not his proud mother. I was an embarrassing accessory, living proof of his humble origins that he was desperate to erase. I saw the pain in Robert's eyes, but he too remained silent, swallowing his wounded pride along with the expensive wine. The marriage to Jennifer cemented the distance between us. She was from a wealthy family and saw Robert and me not as family, but as a charity project, or worse, a stain on her impeccable social reputation. Our house, which to me was a sanctuary of memories, was to her cramped and old-fashioned. Visits became rare and tense. Jennifer had a habit of reorganizing my kitchen whenever she came over, moving my jars around, subtly criticizing my old pans, in a passive-aggressive gesture that made me feel like an incompetent housewife in my own territory. The gifts they gave us were expensive and impersonal. A cashmere scarf I would never wear, a complicated electronic gadget Robert didn't know how to operate. They were gestures that fulfilled a social obligation, but contained not an ounce of genuine affection. Mark, for his part, was completely absorbed into his wife's world. He adopted her values, her silent contempt for everything simple. They began to speak of us in the third person, as if we were a problem to be managed. "We need to see what to do with them when Dad's health gets worse," I once heard Jennifer whisper to him on the phone. Thinking I wasn't listening, the word "they" hit me hard. We were no longer Mom and Dad. We were they, an item on the to-do list of a busy, successful couple. The pain of rejection was a constant companion, a shadow that grew longer as the years passed and Robert's health began to fail. The second great humiliation, the one that broke what was left of my spirit, happened during the last Thanksgiving we spent with Robert. He was already weak, and the doctor had given us the news that his heart was failing. Still, I insisted on cooking the turkey, on filling the house with the smells of our tradition, as a desperate attempt to cling to normalcy. We invited my niece and her husband, so the house would feel fuller, happier. The conversation inevitably turned to finances and the rising costs of Robert's care. That's when Mark, with the coldness of a surgeon, delivered the sentence. "Jennifer and I are doing our best to help, but we need to be realistic. Our investments are for our future, and we're already overburdened with extra expenses." He said the last part looking directly at me and Robert, who was sitting in his armchair, breathing with difficulty. The silence in the room was absolute. My niece looked down at her plate, embarrassed. Jennifer, sensing her cue, added with false sweetness, What Mark means is that this house is too big, Eleanor. The upkeep, the taxes, it becomes a burden. The words extra expenses and burden echoed in the room. They weren't talking about bills or taxes. They were talking about us. My husband's life and my dedication were a financial burden. I felt naked, exposed, judged, and condemned in front of my family. I held my head high, offering more mashed potatoes with a voice I barely recognized as my own. But inside, something broke forever. The months that followed were a blur of doctor's appointments, sleepless nights, and the sound of Robert's increasingly weak breathing beside me in bed. I became his nurse, his cook, his only constant companion. Mark and Jennifer's visits were short, efficient, and devoid of any human warmth. They didn't come to comfort their father, but to assess the situation, to plan the next steps. Robert's death, when it finally came, was both a release from his suffering and the beginning of my nightmare. Amidst the fog of grief and funeral preparations, Mark took control of all the paperwork. "Let me handle this, Mom. You're in no condition," he said, and I, too exhausted to question him, handed everything over. He was fast, organized, almost robotic in his efficiency. I vaguely remember a large brown envelope with an official county court seal that arrived in the mail a few days before the funeral. I thought it was something related to property taxes, another piece of bureaucracy for the pile Mark was managing. Without thinking, I placed it on the mantelpiece, among the condolence cards, and completely forgot about it. Now, as the cold of the Cleveland night began to seep into my thin coat, the image of that envelope returned to my mind with terrifying clarity. That night, cast out and invisible, my mind went back to a detail I had ignored in the fog of grief. A brown envelope, with an official seal, that had arrived days before the funeral. I had left it on the mantelpiece, untouched, and suddenly, I had the terrifying certainty that in that envelope lay a truth that, had I seen it in time, could have changed everything. I wandered aimlessly through the streets of Cleveland as night swallowed the last of the daylight. The cold came not just from the autumn wind, but from within my bones, an ice planted by betrayal. People passed by me, living their lives, oblivious to the invisible 68-year-old woman who had just lost everything. I clutched the small wooden box in my hands. It was my only link to who I had been. The lights of a 24-hour diner shone in the darkness like a promise of warmth. I went in, not out of hunger, but for the need of a refuge, a place to escape the stairs and the biting cold. I sat in a corner booth, the smell of coffee and grease in the air, and ordered a tea I could barely afford. The warmth of the cup in my hands was the only kindness I had felt that day. I watched the other people, couples laughing, students hunched over books, and my loneliness was an abyss. I tried to be strong, but the tears began to roll silently down my face, hot and salty, tracing the map of my pain. That's when a young waitress approached my table. She was young, maybe in her 20s, with dark, tired eyes that held a spark of kindness. Her accent was soft as she offered more hot water for my tea. "On the house," she said with a small smile. Then, leaning in a little, she asked in a low voice, "Are you okay, ma'am?" Those 3 simple words, spoken with genuine concern by a complete stranger, were the key that opened the floodgates. All the control I had maintained in front of Mark, all the silent dignity, crumbled. I began to cry, no longer silently, but with sobs that shook my entire body. A grief for the loss of my husband mixed with the agony of being discarded by my son. The waitress, whose name tag read Sophia, didn't back away. She simply pulled up a chair and sat beside me, waiting for the storm to pass. Her presence a silent act of compassion worth more than 1,000 empty words. Between sobs, the whole story came pouring out of me. I told her about Robert, about the funeral, about the key that wouldn't turn in the lock, about Mark's cold words and the humiliation in front of my neighbor. Sophia listened to it all without interrupting, her face expressing a deep empathy that seemed to come from her own experience with life's hardships. When I finished, silence hung for a moment. And then she made a decision that would change the course of my life. "I'm from Mexico," she said softly. "Back home, we don't leave our elders alone." She looked at her own hands, then at me. "I live nearby, in a small apartment. It's not much, but it has a sofa bed. Stay with me until you find a place." I was speechless. A stranger, a young immigrant who was likely struggling to pay her own bills, was offering me a home, when my own son, with his huge house and luxury car, had thrown me onto the street like I was trash. Shame and instinct told me to refuse, not to be a burden to anyone else. But then I looked into Sophia's face and saw a decency and a strength that filled me with a hope I thought was dead. Accepting her help wasn't an act of weakness, but my first act of rebellion. It was the choice to trust in the kindness of a stranger rather than drown in the cruelty of my own blood. I accept," I whispered, my voice hoarse from crying. For the first time on that terrible day, I didn't feel completely alone. That night, I fell asleep, on a stranger's sofa, to the sound of traffic on a street I didn't know. And, for the first time, I realized that a home is not made of bricks, but of kindness. The next morning, what I did with this newfound strength would leave everyone, especially Mark, speechless. We would like to feel your presence in this very moment. Please, write in the comments which city you are watching from and what time it is there now. By doing this, we create a network of energy and support for this story. AI. Reminder that we are not alone in our battles. Each comment is a point of light in our healing process. The next morning, I woke to the smell of fresh coffee and the sight of Sophia getting ready for her shift. In the soft morning light filtering through her small apartment window, a clarity cut through the fog of my grief. The image of that brown envelope on the mantelpiece returned, no longer as a fuzzy memory, but as a key piece of evidence. I understood that Mark's power over me came from my own passivity and ignorance. He was counting on my grief to keep me weak. With a determination I hadn't felt in years, I asked Sophia to take me to the public library. There, with hands still trembling, I used a computer for the first time in a decade. I researched wills, widows' rights in Ohio, and most importantly, I found the address for the Legal Aid Society. I didn't know what I was looking for exactly, but I knew I could no longer be a victim. That small act of taking the reins of my own life was more frightening and more invigorating than anything I had ever done. With Sophia by my side, holding my hand, I told my story to a young legal aid lawyer named David. He listened patiently, his expression growing more serious with every word. When I mentioned the official envelope and Mark's haste in handling all the paperwork, his eyes narrowed. He made a few calls. The truth, when it came, was crueler and, at the same time, more hopeful than I could have imagined. Robert, in his last months of life, seeing the growing coldness of our son, had secretly amended his will. He had not left me destitute. He had granted me a life estate, which meant the house was mine to live in until the day I died. Mark knew this. He had illegally evicted me, hiding the document that proved my right, planning to make me sign away that right amidst my grief so he could sell the house quickly. My son hadn't just abandoned me. He had committed deliberate fraud against me. Months passed. Mark, growing more impatient to sell the property, finally found me. He showed up at Sophia's small apartment with the same arrogance as always, treating the place with disdain and barely looking at the young woman who had saved me. He held out a folder with papers. "Sign this, Mom, and we can be done with this mess," he said. But the man before me did not find the broken woman he had left in the cold. Strengthened by Sophia's care and armed with the truth, I stood up. "I'm not signing anything, Mark," I said, my voice calm and firm. "You took my house, but you will not take my dignity. This young woman, a complete stranger, gave me a home when my own son threw me on the street. She is my family now." He stood there, dumbfounded, in disbelief. Instead of tearing up the papers, I pushed them back at him and added, "My lawyer will be in contact with yours." The look of shock and panic on his face was the only justice I needed to see. To avoid a public scandal and a lawsuit he would certainly lose, Mark was forced to agree to a settlement. The house was sold, but he had to give me half of the value, an amount that would ensure my security for the rest of my life. With the money, Sophia and I did not seek luxury. The first thing I did was make sure she could quit one of her 2 jobs and enroll in night classes, as she had always dreamed. Then, we rented a slightly larger apartment with 2 bedrooms and a sunny kitchen. With what was left, we started a small home catering business. I, with my old recipes that Mark had always despised, and Sophia, with her energy and intelligence, began to build something of our own. Our apartment, though modest, was always filled with the smell of good food and the sound of our laughter. People in our new community began to know us as the ladies from Ellie and Sophia's kitchen. Our customers didn't just buy our food, they shared their stories. I discovered a purpose that went beyond being just someone's mother or wife. Mark was left with his money and bought a modern, sterile apartment where he lives alone. I used my share to build a life. He has expensive walls. I have a family. He has silence. I have human warmth. I discovered that true wealth is not in what you own, but in the connections you nurture. Today, I do not have luxury, but I have respect. And that, no one can ever take from me again.